That morning, my dog refused to come inside. My German Shepherd was curled around something so small it barely moved in the snow. That something was a freezing wolf pup, and she had chosen my dog's doorstep as her last bit of warmth. Out here on the edge of Bozeman, Montana, winter doesn't shout. It just presses in on you, quiet and heavy, until you notice the way breath hangs in the air and paws leave sharp little prints that fill with ice. I stood there in the open doorway, warm air behind my back, cold air on my face, watching my dog do something I had never seen him do. He should have bolted straight for the kitchen, nails clicking on the floor, tail beating the cabinets like every other morning. Instead, he was folded in a tight arc around that tiny, shivering body, his chest puffing out little clouds of steam over her. At first, I thought it was some lost puppy from the neighborhood, a stray that had wandered too far from a porch light. Then I saw the shape of her head, the narrow muzzle, the ears that were just a little too sharp, the gray and white fur dusted with frost. This wasn't a pet gone missing. This was a wolf pup. Small enough to fit under my arm, lying in the snow like the ground had simply taken all her strength and wouldn't give it back. She barely moved when I stepped closer. Just a tiny twitch of her paw, a slow, shaky breath that sounded more like a sigh than a fight. Frost clung to her whiskers and the edges of her lashes, and for a second I honestly wondered how long she had been there before my dog found her. He lifted his head and looked at me, eyes clear, steady, almost offended that I was taking so long to understand. He didn't growl, didn't flinch, didn't try to drag her away. He just shifted closer, pressing his side tighter against her, as if to say, "Whatever this is, she's with me now." I knew enough about the wild to know this wasn't my world to control. Wolves belong to the hills and the timber lines, not to back decks and doormats. But looking at that tiny body pressed into the hollow of my dog's chest, it was hard to think in terms of rules and territories. If I closed the door, the house would stay warm, the coffee would smell the same, and the morning would go on. Out there, on the wrong side of the threshold, she had maybe an hour of warmth left in her. I didn't know if I had any right to interfere with the way the wild writes its stories. I just knew I couldn't bring myself to turn away from the one that had landed on my doorstep. She weighed almost nothing when I picked her up. Just a bundle of fur and cold air and a heartbeat I had to lean in to feel. I slid one arm under her chest and one under her hind legs, half expecting teeth, a snap, some last flash of instinct. Nothing. Her head barely lolled toward me, breath thin and quiet against my wrist as I carried her inside. By the fireplace, I laid out old towels, folded a heavy blanket into a shallow nest, and set her down as gently as I knew how. The heat from the fire reached us in waves, turning the frost on her fur into tiny drops that clung there for a moment, then disappeared. My German Shepherd pushed past me without hesitation, circled once, and folded himself right up against her. He tucked his paws tight so he wouldn't pin her, then stretched his neck over her back, breathing slow and steady along her spine like he was trying to share every bit of warmth he had. I grabbed my phone and called the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center. I told them there was a wolf pup on my rug, that she was breathing but cold, that I didn't want to do the wrong thing. They talked me through it in calm, practiced voices. No hot water, no sudden heat, small sips if she could swallow, just time and gentle warmth. I set a shallow bowl of water nearby, more for later than now, and sat down on the floor beside them. When I reached out to lay a hand lightly along her side, she didn't move toward me, she moved toward him. She pressed her nose into his chest, eyes squeezed shut, like that was the only place in the world that made sense. Her breathing was still shallow, but it started to follow his rhythm, in and out, as if her body was borrowing his courage along with his heat. At one point, she shifted just enough to look up. Her eyes opened, huge and amber and completely wild, and for a second they met mine. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a stray puppy I could just keep because my heart wanted to. This was a piece of the wild lying on my rug, and whatever happened next was going to change more than my morning. The first night felt longer than most winters I've lived through. The house was dim except for the fire, throwing soft light across the walls and turning my living room into one small island of color in a gray world. Outside, the wind dragged along the siding and rattled the trees, that low, restless sound Montana makes when it's not sure if it's done snowing. Inside, my dog lay on the rug with his chin resting across the tiny curve of the pup's back. Every time she twitched in her sleep, he opened his eyes, checked her, and then let them slide closed again. I sat on the floor a few feet away, back against the couch, feeling my knees complain and ignoring them. I'd seen wolves before, years ago, just specks against a far ridge line, moving as one line of gray across the snow. I'd always respected that distance, the quiet agreement that their world and mine only brushed shoulders at the edges. Now a piece of that distant ridge was breathing on my rug. The rehab center had told me to give her small, careful amounts of warm formula, nothing rushed, nothing forced. So every so often I lifted her head with one hand and eased the tip of the syringe to her lips, watching for any sign she could swallow. My dog did the rest. He would lick gently at her muzzle, just enough to trigger a tiny reflex, and I'd see her throat work, one slow swallow at a time. She shivered in little bursts, paws paddling at nothing, like her body still thought it was running through drifts somewhere far from my fire. Once, her back leg jerked hard and she let out a sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a bark, more like a memory trying to push its way out. Closer to dawn, the room felt smaller, quieter, as if we were the only three left awake in the whole state. The pup tried to lift her head on her own and a fragile, breathy howl slipped out, barely louder than the crackle of the logs. My dog answered with a low sound from deep in his chest, not loud, not sharp, just a steady rumble that filled the space between them. For a moment after that, her breathing stuttered and went thin, and I found myself counting the seconds between each rise of her ribs. Then she drew in one long, quiet breath that sounded almost determined, and without any help from my hands, she nudged herself closer into his chest and stayed there. Morning came, but she stayed. When I woke up, the fire was down to orange coals and my living room smelled like warm dog and wood smoke. The little wolf wasn't a frozen ball anymore. She was still small and shaky, but her fur had dried, and when she blinked up at me, her eyes were clearer, less clouded by cold and fear. Rogan stretched first, that long, slow ripple from nose to tail, careful not to disturb her. She tried to copy him, paws sliding on the towel, back legs not quite sure what to do yet. He adjusted without thinking, bracing himself so she could lean against his shoulder while she figured out how to stand. My phone buzzed on the table. It was the rehab center calling back. I stepped a few feet away but kept them in my sight. My name is Grant, I'm 52, and I've spent most of my life working with dogs, not wolves, I told them, and I heard my own voice, steady but tired, in my ears. They reminded me this wasn't a pet I'd found in a shelter parking lot. Keep handling to a minimum, they said. Don't cuddle her just because she's cute. Feed her right, let her rest, let your dog do what he's already doing, and remember she belongs to a world that isn't built out of couches and coffee tables. When I hung up and turned back, Rogan had already taken the lesson to heart in his own way. He eased his bowl toward her with his nose and waited while she nosed around it, figuring out what was food and what was just smell. When she stepped straight into his dish with both front paws, he didn't correct her. He simply shifted sideways, gave a soft, warning rumble when she slipped too close to the fireplace, and her ears flicked back in quick apology. The whole day went like that. Small experiments. Short naps. Her testing where his patience ended and finding out it didn't, not with her. That evening, when the light went blue and thin, I caught her sitting by the glass door, not watching me, not watching the bowl. Her nose was tilted toward the tree line beyond the yard, ears forward, completely still, like she was listening for a voice only she could hear. A week later, she was still small enough to fit between my hands, but the frostbitten look was gone. Her legs had a little more steadiness to them. Her eyes were brighter. She didn't feel like a shadow anymore. That morning, I opened the back door and let the cold roll in across the kitchen floor. The yard out here is fenced, nothing fancy, just enough to keep a curious nose from wandering too far. Snow only came up past my boots in patches, not the deep drifts of the high country. Rogan stepped out first like he always did, nose down, checking his world. She hesitated on the threshold, paws splayed, staring at all that white like it might swallow her. Then she ducked under him, pressed herself to his belly, and moved with him as he walked into the yard. For a while, she was just a second set of legs under his, a shadow glued to his chest. It didn't last. He gave one short bounce, almost like a question, and then took off at an easy trot across the snow. She blinked, watched him, then made one clumsy leap after him. Her feet punched straight through the crust, and she disappeared up to her belly, staring down at the hole she'd made like the snow had betrayed her. When she scrambled out, she shook herself, sneezed once, then tried again. This time she chased the flakes themselves, snapping at them, missing, tumbling, getting back up. Rogan read the moment and spun his tail just close enough for her to pounce. He let her catch it once, let her feel that small victory, then pulled away and loped a slow circle so she could follow. At one point, they both stopped to breathe, steam puffing from their mouths in short little clouds. She walked up beside him, dropped her narrow head onto his front paw, and let out a sound that was more howl than whine, thin but sure of itself. It slipped out of me before I thought about it. "Easy, Lumi," I said under my breath. "You're safe." The name settled on her like it had been waiting there all along. Later, when the games were over and their tracks had tangled the yard into a map only they could read, I saw her standing alone at the far corner by the fence. Her nose was lifted to the wind, ears sharp, eyes fixed past the property line toward the dark line of trees, and for a moment she looked less like a pup on my snow and more like something that belonged to the hills behind it. Days started to blur a little after that. Snow, coffee, back door, 2 sets of paws, same rhythm, different details. Lumi grew, but she stayed small beside Rogan. She copied him almost frame for frame. If he sat, she sat. If he shook off outside, she shook off, sending a little halo of snow around her. If he dropped down in front of the fireplace at night, she curled into the same shape right up against his ribs. Sometimes I'd catch them both yawning in perfect sync, jaws wide, thy tongues curled. One big dog and one wild little shadow, trying on his life like a borrowed coat. But there were moments when that coat didn't quite fit. Every now and then, she'd slip away from his side and go to the window. She'd stand there, nose almost touching the glass, breathing in whatever the wind brought from the hills. Her ears would tilt toward sounds I couldn't hear, her whole body leaning into a world that wasn't mine. I called the rehab center again. Told them how she was walking, eating, following my dog, how she came when he came and settled when he settled. They listened, then reminded me gently what they'd said before. She's still a wild animal, they told me. There's a chance, if things go right, that she can be reintroduced to her own kind. But it takes time, careful steps, no turning her into a novelty, no pretending a wolf is just a different kind of house dog. I looked over at her while they talked, at the way she tucked her nose into the thick fur of Rogan's chest, like it was the safest place on earth. She didn't look like something dangerous. She looked like a pup who had decided that this big, steady dog was her entire sky. I'll be honest with you. I told them I was scared to get more attached than I already was. Scared of doing what was best for her and losing her because of it. Scared of doing what was easiest for me and failing her in the long run. On the other end of the line, they didn't rush me. They just said, in a few weeks, we can come out, take a look at her, watch how she moves, see how she responds. Then we'll talk about the next step. When I hung up, the house felt the same. Fire in the stove, nails on the floor, 2 animals breathing on the rug. But in the back of my mind, their words sat there like a quiet timer, already counting down for this strange little family we'd become. The day the sun finally showed up again, they were ready for more than the backyard. The sky went that sharp, clear blue we get here when the cold is dry and honest. Snow still covered most of the ground, but the wind had carved it into low waves, and patches of brown grass showed through on the open field behind my place. I clipped Rogan's leash for the walk out, more for form than anything, and let Lumi trot along at his side. Her paws were bigger now, her steps more sure, but she still checked in with him every few yards, touching his shoulder with her nose like she was making sure the world hadn't changed too much. When we reached the field, I unclipped him and watched his whole body shift. He lowered his head, drew in a lungful of cold air, then took off at an easy, rolling run across the snow. Lumi hesitated for a heartbeat, then followed. Her first few strides were awkward, back legs trying to catch up with the front, but momentum did what it always does. She stretched out, chasing his tail, his shadow, the space just behind his heels. They looped the field in wide arcs, White kicking up behind them, Rogan adjusting his speed so she could catch him every so often. When he slowed, she would barrel into his side, bounce back, and then dash ahead like she was the one leading. I just stood there and watched, boots planted, hands in my pockets, feeling like the least important creature on that snow. Then something shifted. In the middle of a run, Lumi stopped dead. Her whole body went still from nose to tail. She turned her head toward the line of trees in the distance, nostrils flaring, ears locked on something I couldn't see or hear. She took 2 careful steps toward the hills, not playful this time, not clumsy, just quiet, focused, like a string inside her had been tugged. Rogan reacted before I could. He moved to stand in front of her, not shoving, not snapping, just planting his body between her and that distant pull. He bumped her chest lightly with his nose, then glanced back at me as if to check in before guiding her back into the loose circle we'd worn into the snow. On the walk home, the light started to thin, shadows stretching long across the small rises behind the house. Somewhere out past the last hill, a real wolf called out, full and deep, the sound rolling over us like water. Lumi froze again, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then she answered, her own voice high and thin but steady, sending her small sound back into that big one. I felt something in my chest tighten as their voices crossed over that field. Whatever line I thought existed between our yard and the wild wasn't nearly as solid as I'd been pretending. A few days after that run on the open field, the weather turned on us again. The sky dropped lower, the wind picked up, and the snow started falling fat and steady instead of light and playful. Letting the dogs out for a quick bathroom break had become muscle memory. Open the back door, feel the rush of cold, watch Rogan trot out first, Lumi glued to his side. That afternoon was no different at first. I slid the door open, they walked out. I told myself it would be just a minute or two. The wind came in hard behind them, pushing the curtain and rattling something out by the fence. I was rinsing a mug at the sink when I heard it. Not a bark, not a growl. Rogan's voice, high and broken, the way he sounded only when something was wrong. By the time I reached the door, snow was blowing sideways. A thin branch had snapped off the old cottonwood, fallen just right against the fence to push one board out of place. The gap wasn't big, but it was big enough for a small, determined body. Rogan was pacing the line, nose to the ground, whining like the sound hurt him. On the other side of that crooked board, there were fresh tracks in the powder, smaller than his, heading out into the white. It took me a second too long to understand what I was seeing. Then my stomach dropped, and I was already pulling on my boots. I called his name, and he tore away from the fence and fell in beside me as we stepped through the opening. The trail was easy to follow. Tiny prints pressed into new snow, weaving between sage and scrub, always just ahead of us. With every step I took, I could feel my fear running one stride in front of my boots, not for me, but for the dog at my side and the little shape we were chasing. We came to the edge of a shallow gully where the land dipped down out of sight. The tracks went right to the lip and then stopped. From somewhere below, thin and ragged and fighting the wind, I heard Lumi howl once. Then the sound was cut clean off, and the only thing left moving was the snow. I eased myself up to the edge of the gully and looked down. She was there, maybe 10 feet below us, standing frozen on a strip of snow no wider than my arm. Rock on one side, a smooth, icy slope on the other, nothing solid beneath her, but a long slide into a deeper hollow. She wasn't bleeding. She wasn't mangled. She was just stuck, muscles locked, paws braced like she was afraid even to breathe. Her eyes were wide and fixed on us, ears trembling, chest moving too fast. Every instinct I had screamed to climb down and grab her, but one look at that slick drop told me how that story could end if I made one bad move. Rogan stepped up beside me, chest heaving from the run, and looked from me to her and back again. His nails clicked on the rock as he shifted, testing the edge. Easy, I told him, more for myself than for him. Wait. He didn't wait long. I gave him one short command, the one we use on hiking trails when I need him to go first and trust me to back him up. He flicked an ear, then started down, placing each paw slowly, feeling for grip. For a moment, his back leg slid a few inches, sending powder down past her, but he dug in and held. Lumi stretched her neck toward him, then took one hesitant step his way, claws scraping. When he reached her, he turned his body sideways, just bracing himself between rock and snow so she had something solid to lean on. She pressed into his flank, shaking, and he lowered his head over her shoulders like he had on my living room rug that first night. "Come on, you two," I said, reaching down as far as my arm would go. Rogan climbed first, muscles bunching, using the small bumps in the rock to push up until I could grab his collar and give him just enough pull. As he moved, Lumi scrambled right behind him, front paws searching, back legs slipping, but always keeping part of her against him like he was the only ladder she trusted. I caught a handful of thick fur at the back of her neck and helped lift that last little bit, heart pounding harder than it should have at my age. When all three of us were finally back on level ground, I sat right where I was and let the world spin for a second. Lumi didn't look back at the gully. She didn't look at the trees. She pressed her whole body into Rogan's chest and stayed there, as if she'd known all along exactly which pack she was trying to get back to. The next morning, 2 trucks from the Wildlife Center pulled into my driveway. We let them come inside on Lumi's terms. No leashes, no dragging, no cornering. She stayed close to Rogan at first, ribs brushing his side, eyes tracking every new pair of boots. When one of the women knelt and held out a gloved hand, Lumi didn't bolt. She glanced up at Rogan, waited for his calm, then stepped forward just enough to sniff. They checked her body condition, teeth, eyes, legs, all the while watching how she moved around him. "As long as he's here, she's braver," one of them said quietly. She wasn't wrong. We sat at my kitchen table afterward while the 2 of them lay on the rug like they'd been doing this all their lives. I braced myself for the speech I'd been dreading. Instead, they surprised me. They talked about building a proper, spacious enclosure on my land, something safe and secure, licensed and supervised by the center. A place where Lumi could live as part of our little pack, without being turned into a prop or a pet, and without becoming a problem for the wild wolves that still belong to these hills. I didn't hide how much relief washed through me, knowing that what they saw between Rogan and Lumi wasn't a mistake, but a chance to help, took a weight off my chest I'd been carrying since that first morning at the door. That evening, while I was cleaning food bowls, my phone rang again. The shelter I volunteer with had a favor to ask. They had a rescued puppy there, badly shaken, not letting anyone near. Could I take him for a while, just until he learned the world wasn't all teeth and noise? I looked over at Rogan and Lumi pressed together on the rug and realized the best healer in this house didn't walk on 2 legs at all. They brought him over in a borrowed crate on a cold evening. He was small, younger than Lumi had been, and shaking so hard the metal rattled every time he moved. When I opened the door, he bolted past me and wedged himself into the tightest corner of the hallway, eyes huge, ribs fluttering under his skin. Every time I shifted my weight, his gaze snapped to me. Every sound in the house felt like too much for him. Rogan saw it first, of course. He stood a few yards away, head low, tail still, giving the little guy space, the way an old teacher gives a frightened student room to breathe. Lumi watched them both. For a second, I saw the pup from my doorstep again, the one who had chosen the snow as her last bit of warmth. Then she did something I'll never forget. She walked toward him slowly, one paw at a time, body loose, not stiff. She lowered herself until she was slightly smaller than he was. She didn't stare into his eyes, didn't crowd him. She just stretched her nose forward and touched his shoulder with the lightest brush of fur, the same way Rogan had once touched hers on my rug. The shaking didn't stop all at once, but it changed. His breaths got a little longer. He took one uncertain step toward her, then another. In a few minutes, he was pressed along her side, stealing warmth the way she once had, while Rogan lay nearby, keeping quiet watch. Sitting there on the floor, I realized this strange pair had already saved more than one life, and the only real question left was how many more scared animals they could pull out of their own kind of snow. Some nights, when the house finally goes quiet, I turn off the TV, sit down on the floor, and just watch them. Lumi stretched along Rogan's chest, the newest rescued puppy, tucked safely between their paws, breathing slow and deep like he finally believes nothing bad is going to happen in the next 5 minutes. Since that winter morning at the doorstep, more frightened dogs have come through this house. Different faces, different stories, the same shaking in their legs when they first arrive, and every time the pattern repeats. They study Rogan from a distance, decide he is solid, safe, not going anywhere. Then, they see Lumi, the little wolf who should have belonged only to the hills, lower herself to the ground and offer the same quiet welcome she once needed so badly. I refill bowls, wash blankets, answer phone calls, but they are the ones doing the real work. They're the ones teaching every new scared pup that warmth can be trusted, that a hand reaching out might mean help this time instead of hurt. When people ask me why I keep saying yes to one more broken tail, one more shaking body, I tell them this. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. Caring for a rescued puppy is more than love. It's responsibility. It's pet care. It's showing up when it would be easier to look away. If you're hearing this, you're already part of their circle. Share their story, support your local shelter or wildlife rehab, talk about the dogs that didn't give up even when the world turned cold on them. Every view, every share, every small act of kindness can pull another animal out of the snow they were never meant to face alone. Join our brave Paws family. Be their voice. Be their hope.